So the real estate rules around commissions changed last August, and it has made an impact in terms of how real estate commissions are handled. So, first, I'm going to talk about how, in practice, the system kind of used to work, right? So, let's just say you were selling your house and you decided that you were going to hire a real estate agent down the street. They came over to your home and they went through their presentation, talked about pricing and all those things, and then you negotiated a commission with them. And typically, I'm just gonna make it up. Commissions are completely negotiable, but let's just say that you agree to pay that agent 5% to sell your home. Now, what would happen is that agent would agree, and when you sign the paperwork, this was in there, that agent was going to collect that 5% and they were going to share part of that commission with the agent who brought the buyer to your transaction. So let's just keep it simple and say they were going to split it right down the middle. They were going to charge 2.5%. They're going to give 2.5% to a buyer's agent. And keep in mind, if there was no buyer's agent, say a buyer walked into the open house and that agent sold the property, that agent kept the full 5%. Okay. That's how it, generally speaking, worked across the country. So, what has changed now? Well, really, what this comes down to is the Department of Justice really wants buyers and sellers to negotiate agency commissions and representation independently. Okay. So the perception of some in the old way that it was handled was essentially that the seller was paying the buyer's agent and that the commissions were fixed in advance. Okay. And then in what was happening in a lot of instances is a buyer would go on Zillow or wherever, and they would grab an agent and say, "I wanna go see this house," and the agent would jump in their car and meet them there and show them the house, and the agent knew how much was being offered as compensation because it was displayed in the MLS for that property. So, that Zillow agent knew that they were gonna get 2.5%, and they showed that person the property, they wrote an offer, and they got paid at closing table. And buyers had this perception that their agent was free because very, very rarely was an actual buyer coming out of pocket to compensate their buyer agent. So now some of the big things that have changed, and these are, I think, really good things for a seller, are a buyer cannot walk into your house and see it without having a buyer agreement in place with their buyer's agent. In that buyer's agreement, the buyer and their agent negotiate how much that buyer is going to compensate that agent. Okay, so this is different. So before we could show a house without having a written agreement, now as a buyer's agent, I cannot. Now, to be really clear, as a listing agent on my listing, I can show a buyer my listing without having to have an agreement in place, and a buyer can walk into an open house without having to have any type of an agreement. But for a buyer to hire a buyer's agent or have a buyer's agent show them a property, there must be an agreement in place, and that has to include the compensation. So, what happens now to you as a seller? So, for example, you and I are going to sit down and we're going to talk about what it's going to cost to sell your house. And the only fee that I'm going to negotiate with you is my own. I'm not negotiating what the buyer agent's going to get paid. Okay. So that means that a few different scenarios can actually happen. Buyer comes along, loves your house, they have their agent. That agent, at their instruction, can request that you, as the seller, credit them as the buyer's agent for the amount of the commission. Okay. So they can still ask you to pay 2.5% or 2% or whatever the number is. But the buyer's agent cannot accept more money than is in that existing buyer's agent agreement. Okay. Following me still? So, scenario one, buyer's agent says to the seller through the seller's agent, "Hey, I'm asking you to pay me 2.5%. You don't have to agree to this as a seller. You could say, "No, I'm not willing to contribute anything um, in terms of commission." Or you may agree up front that you want to contribute a set amount, or you may say, Sure. You know what? I want to get my home sold and I will agree to a reasonable commission amount that's requested by a buyer's agent. And what's reasonable? Well, that's up to you to decide as a seller. Option number 2 is you may get no request to pay commission. Maybe the buyer's agent has worked out a deal with their buyer and the buyer is just going to pay them at closing directly and not request any credit from you. Or maybe they're only going to request part of the credit from you. So there's a lot of different ways that buyer agent commission can now be handled in a transaction. It makes it a little bit more confusing in some ways and it introduces more steps to the process. But what I like for my sellers is you may you don't know that you're going to pay, I'll just use the example, 5% anymore. You may pay 2.5% to your listing agent. You may pay 3.5% because the buyer's agent only asked for 1%. It's all negotiable. And that's really the whole point of this whole thing, this whole lawsuit and settlement. So, bottom line is this: as a seller, when you're looking at what your net proceeds are going to be, I typically will model this out a few different ways for my clients. Here's what happens if there's an unrepresented buyer and they're not asking to pay any buyer's agent. Here's what happens if it's a buyer who wants me to represent them as well as you, right? Or here's what happens if it's a 2.5% request or a 3% request. We model that out so that you know all the scenarios for what your net's going to be. But the bottom line is you're not required to offer it, and you're not required to offer a blanket amount to all buyers across the board.